Statements by Ministers none. Public bills, first reading.
Mr. Speaker, sir, I beg to move that the Covid-19 Miscellaneous Provisions Bill number 1 of 2020 be read a first time. Mr. Speaker, sir, I beg to move that the Quarantine Bill number 2 of 2020 be read a first time.
Second reading.
Mr. Speaker, sir, with your permission, I move that the Covid-19 Miscellaneous Provisions Bill number 1 of 2020 and the Quarantine Bill number 2 of 2020 be taken together and be read a second time, inasmuch as both bills have the same objective of strengthening our preparedness for and response to the Covid-19 and to any future pandemic. Mr. Speaker, sir, in my statement to the House at the sitting of Tuesday, 5th of May 2020, I announced that in the context of our fight against the Covid-19, government would be introducing the following legislation in the National Assembly: the Covid-19 bill, a new quarantine bill, and a new public health bill. The presentation of the Covid-19 bill and the new quarantine bill today is an eloquent testimony of the unflinching determination with which this government is waging the war against the Covid-19. I must say that the preparation of these bills has been quite a challenging task, requiring a lot of arduous work at protracted hours, not only because of the present circumstances of the curfew, but also because of their scope and complexity. Mr. Speaker, sir, while the Public Health Bill is being worked upon, the two bills we are introducing today constitute an important component of the legislative response of the government in its efforts, not only to contain the spread of the Covid-19, but also to better prepare our country to face and recover from a Covid-like situation in the future. The aim is to ensure that Mauritius has a modern and appropriate legal framework to deal with any future pandemic. Mr. Speaker, sir, let me start with the Covid-19 Miscellaneous Provisions Bill number 1 of 2020. The object of this bill is to amend a number of enactments to cater for the impact of Covid-19 in various sectors, mitigate the hardship on the population, and facilitate recovery. Moreover, the bill also seeks to enhance our preparedness in general to face a Covid-like situation in the future. In fact, the bill is amending 56 enactments, and I shall now provide a brief outline of these proposed amendments. Clause 2 of the bill is amending Sections 6, 46, and 47 of the Bank of Mauritius Act to allow the bank to, inter alia, 1. Invest, with the approval of the board, such amounts of official foreign reserves as the board may determine in any corporation or company set up for the purpose of facilitating economic development. And 2, approve such grant from the Special Reserve Fund to assist the government in the stabilization of the economy on account of the negative impact of Covid-19 on the economy of Mauritius. Mr. Speaker, sir, these amendments to the Bank of Mauritius Act are being brought to provide financial support to government in the implementation of various initiatives to address the negative impact of Covid-19, including assistance to employees in private enterprises and individuals in the informal sector, and to support economic recovery. Across the world, central banks such as the Federal Reserve Bank and the Bank of England have been providing financial support to government as well as to private enterprises and the household sector in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic. Clauses 3 and 4 are respectively amending the CB Act and the CWA Act to allow the extension of the deadline for the payment of license fees, bills, rates, charges, or other duties during the COVID-19 period. Clause 5 amends the Chemical Fertilizers Control Act to prevent licensees from withholding stock of fertilizers for the purpose of profiteering. This is being done to discourage such practice, especially during a COVID-like situation. Clause 6 amends the Civil Status Act to allow the extension of the deadline for the registration of birth and publication of marriages which cannot be made during the COVID-19 period. Mr. Speaker, sir, I now come to Clause 7, which is amending the Companies Act. Due to the COVID-19 outbreak, stakeholders could not comply with certain requirements within the time specified in the Act. Most stakeholders find themselves in difficult situation to comply with the strict delays and procedures as laid down in the law. Consequently, amendments are being made for certain statutory deadlines to be extended during the COVID-19 period. Moreover, the registrar is being empowered to issue such directions, guidelines, or instructions as may be necessary for the administration of the Companies Act, including holding of meetings during the COVID-19 period. Mr. Speaker, sir, I shall propose the minor amendment to Clause 7B1 at committee stage. A copy of the amendment is being circulated. Clause 8 brings amendment to the Consumer Protection Price and Supplies Control Act, provide for any person committing an offence under the Act to be given the option of choosing between accepting a fixed penalty notice or proceedings being taken before a court. Clause 9 amends the Courts Act to provide for the maintenance of essential judicial services during the COVID-19 period, including the practice and procedures before any court during such period. Clause 10 is amending the Criminal Code in sections 4, 5, 6, 378 and 385 so as to increase the fines for crimes, misdemeanors and contraventions. It is to be noted that spitting in public place will now be an offence. Clause 11 brings amendment to the Customs Act in section 76, provide that goods entering during the period 2nd of November 2019 and ending 31st of December 2020 may be warehoused for a period of 36 months from date of entry. Presently, goods which entered bonded warehouses after 2nd of November 2019 can be stored for a maximum period of 24 months only. With the COVID-19 pandemic, economic operators will be facing difficulty for the sale of bonded goods. Hence, the increase in the statutory time frame for the removal of goods entered in bonded warehouses. Clause 12 amends the Customs Tariff Act to provide for the creation of a new tariff line to give effect to the measure to remove value-added tax on hand sanitizers. Clause 13 brings amendment to the Data Protection Act such that the issue of any license or permit during the COVID-19 period shall be exempt from the application of the Act. Clause 14 is amending the Education Act to provide during closure of educational institutions for distance education and online learning programs, including broadcast lessons and their modalities. Provisions are also being made for disciplinary procedures to be instituted against any teaching and non-teaching staff who, without reasonable excuse, fail to engage in distance education during the closure of educational institutions. Moreover, the Minister of Education will be empowered to make necessary regulations to provide for a number of measures, including social and physical distancing, attendance of non-teaching staff, dispensing of distance education, and other relevant measures during and after the temporary closure of educational institutions. Mr. Speaker, sir, I now come to the proposed amendment to the Employment Relations Act. It is widely accepted now that harmonious employment relations should underpin our industrial relations system and that the right to strike should be exercised as a last resort. The Employment Relations Act sets clear procedures for dispute resolution and for right to strike. In this exceptional period we are living in today, we are making provisions for a different approach to address the issue of dispute resolution when it comes to assuring the basic needs of the population and the survival of the economy. As regards the right to strike more generally, I would like to state in unequivocal terms that this government recognizes the right to strike as a fundamental right. However, as a responsible government which has at heart the well-being of its citizens and the survival of the economy, we have to come up with bold measures. Therefore, to safeguard the national interest, an amendment is being brought to Section 15A of the Employment Relations Act to prohibit the right to strike only in critical sectors listed in Part 1 of the third schedule, including health services, port and airport services, and related activities during the Covid-19 period, and such further period as may be prescribed by the Minister of Labour. Provisions will be made for compulsory arbitration for these sectors during that period. I shall propose an appropriate amendment to Clause 15A of the bill at committee stage. I wish to point out that the procedure of compulsory arbitration already exists in the Employment Relations Act for the Mauritius Fire and Rescue Services, the Mauritius Prisons, and the Police Force. These provisions are now being extended, amongst others, to the health services, port and airport services, and other related activities. Mr. Speaker, sir, Clause 16 amends the Environment Protection Act to provide inter alia that 1. An EIA license which expires during the COVID-19 period shall remain valid for a period of 30 days after the COVID-19 period, or for such further period as may be prescribed. And 2. Hotels, guest house, or tourist residence of more than 4 bedrooms shall be exempted from the payment of environment protection fee for the period from 1st of March 2020 to 31st December 2020, or such other period as may be prescribed. Mr. Speaker, sir, presently, the rearing of poultry above 5,000 requires a preliminary environment report. This figure is being raised to 15,000 with a view to improving food security. I wish to point out, however, that clearance from all relevant authorities would still be required, and the activity would be subject to a number of conditions and guidelines. Clause 17 is amending the Finance and Audit Act. The proposed amendment is required as the limit of 3.5 billion rupees on advances from the Consolidated Fund has proved to be a constraint for meeting urgent and unforeseen expenditure, particularly in emergency situations, such as the outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic. Government had to incur urgent and unforeseen expenditure in view of the outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic, particularly for the implementation of the wage assistance scheme to provide financial support to employees of the private sector who were affected by the curfew, and the self-employed assistance scheme for individuals of the informal sector who could not carry out their business activities. The present limit of 3.5 billion rupees is therefore being increased to 15 billion rupees. The Financial Reporting Act is being amended by Clause 18 so as to allow auditors to produce, upon request, books, documents or records to the Council, whether in electronic form or not. Clause 19 brings amendment to the Financial Services Act to provide for the modalities for the Board to hold meetings by means of audio and audiovisual communication, and for decisions to be taken by means of resolutions. Clause 20 is amending the Foundations Act to provide for the registrar to issue, during the COVID-19 period, such directions, guidelines, or instructions as may be necessary for the administration of the Act. Due to the COVID-19 outbreak, stakeholders could not comply with certain requirements within the time specified in the Act. Most stakeholders find themselves in difficult situation to comply with the strict delays and procedures as laid down in the law during the COVID-19 period and after, hence the proposed amendment. Clause 21 seeks to amend the Freeport Act to, inter alia, authorize a private Freeport developer to provide during the COVID-19 period and such further period as may be prescribed warehousing facilities for the storage of goods in a Freeport zone to any person. This will allow the State Trading Corporation to secure, in the national interest, storage facilities in order to avoid shortage of LPG during the COVID-19 period and such further period as may be prescribed. Clause 22 amends the Gambling Regulatory Authority Act to provide, inter alia, for the authority to direct any licensee to temporarily cease operation during the COVID-19 period. Moreover, no tax or duty shall be payable by a licensee during the period he will not be authorized to operate. Clause 23 brings amendments to the Immigration Act to provide that the permits which expired during the COVID-19 period shall remain valid for a period of 30 days after the COVID-19 period, or for such other period as may be prescribed. Clause 24 brings amendments to the Income Tax Act, inter alia for 1. Individuals and companies contributing to COVID-19 Solidarity Fund to be entitled to relief by way of deduction from net income of the amount contributed. 2. Introducing a COVID-19 levy to recoup the amount of financial support paid under the wage assistance scheme to businesses which have made profits. Mr. Speaker, sir, the levy for a corporate will be the lower of the amount of wage assistance scheme claimed, or 15% of its taxable profits. As for an employer who is an individual, the levy will be the lower of an amount of wage assistance scheme claimed, or 15% of gross business income after deduction of specified allowable expenditure. The levy will be applicable for 2 years, and businesses which have made no taxable profits will not be subject to the levy. In the case of an individual who has claimed support under the wage assistance scheme, the levy will be payable at the time of submission of income tax returns in September-October 2020 and September-October 2021. As regards a corporate whose accounting period ends between 1st May 2020 and 31st December 2020, the levy will be payable in respect of the year of assessment commencing on 1st July 2020 and the year of assessment commencing on 1st July 2021. A corporate whose accounting period ends between 1st January 2021 and 30th April 2021, the levy will be payable in respect of the year assessment commencing on 1st July 2021 and the year of assessment commencing on 1st July 2022. The Minister of Finance may, by way of regulations, exclude certain category of employers from the levy. The bill also gives power to the Director General of the MRA to administer the levy, including inter alia recovery powers, imposition of penalty and interest for late payment, and anti-avoidance provisions. The amendments to the Income Tax Act also provide for the setting up of a framework and modalities for the management of the Government Wage Assistance Scheme and the Self-Employed Assistance Scheme. Mr. Speaker, sir, I shall move at committee stage for an amendment to Clause 24C of the bill relating to the COVID-19 levy. The levy is being made to apply for 2 years instead of 1 year on profitable businesses. If in the first year of the levy, the full amount of wage support is not recouped from a business which has made profits, the shortfall may be recouped in the following year. However, in any given year, the levy shall not exceed 15% of taxable profits of that business or the amount paid under the wage assistance scheme, whichever is the lower. Clause 25 amends the Independent Police Complaints Commission Act to extend the statutory deadlines to file complaints in cases where such deadlines fall during or after the COVID-19 period. Clause 26 brings amendment to the Information, Communication and Technologies Act so as to provide inter alia for an extension of the validity of licenses issued during the COVID-19 period. The proposed amendments also provide that no interest, penalty or surcharge shall be charged or payable on late payments by operators and licensees, provided that the payment is made not later than 30 days after the COVID-19 period lapses. Clause 27 is amending the Insolvency Act inter alia to 1. Raise the threshold for the court to make bankruptcy order against a debtor from 50,000 rupees to 100,000 rupees. It is to be noted that since the passing of the Act in June 2009, this amount has remained unchanged. The increase in threshold will provide additional protection to enterprises in difficulty. 2. Provide that a resolution for the winding up or voluntary winding up of a company passed during the COVID-19 period or during a period of 3 months after expiry of the COVID-19 period shall be deemed to be void. However, this shall not apply to a company holding a global business license. 3. The statutory demand under Section 180 of the Insolvency Act to be increased from 100,000 rupees to 250,000 rupees. According to Section 180, if a company is indebted in the sum of 100,000 rupees or more, legal action may be taken by a creditor to recover the amount due. However, during this period of confinement, companies may face liquidity problem and this situation may result in a closing down. The increase in the amount from 100,000 rupees to 250,000 rupees is to protect a company during difficult period. And 4, provide that the appointment of any receiver or receiver manager during a COVID-19 period will be void. Clause 28 of the bill is amending sections 2 of the Interpretation and General Clauses Act to insert a definition for the term COVID-19 period as follows. COVID-19 period means the period A, starting on 23rd March 2020, B, ending on 1st of June 2020, or ending on such later date as may be prescribed under the Public Health Act. Sections 37 and 39 of the Interpretation and General Clauses Act are also being amended to make provisions such that A, during a COVID-19 period, board meetings of statutory corporations may, subject to there being a quorum, be held by means of audio and audiovisual communication. B, resolutions in writing, signed and assented by persons entitled to receive notice of the meeting may be used for the purposes of making and validating board decisions. C, resolutions may be done by different means, including facsimile, electronic mail, and other similar means of communication. D, where under any enactment, statutory time limits which expire or fall wholly or partly during the COVID-19 period, or during a period of 30 days after the COVID-19 period expires, may be extended by regulations under that relevant enactment. These time limits deal inter alia with judicial proceedings, payments, applications for licenses, time limits for decisions or determinations, and time limits for doing or refraining from doing any other acts or things. E, in addition, these statutory time limits may be extended by regulations made under the relevant enactments for the following additional matters. 1, application for a license, including an application for a renewal. 2, time limit to make a decision or give a determination. 3, time limit to register a document. 4, time limit to serve a notice or other document. And 5, time limit to do or refrain from doing an act. The proposed new section 39B of the Interpretation and General Clauses Act provides for the extension of a license which expires during the COVID-19 period or during a period of 30 days after the COVID-19 period expires. The said extension shall be for such a date as may be prescribed by regulations under the relevant enactment. The proposed new section 39C of the Interpretation and General Clauses Act provides for the exemption from charges, interest, penalty, surcharge, or any other additional fee payable where the time for payment expires, falls wholly or partly during the COVID-19 period, or during a period of 30 days after the COVID-19 period expires. The proposed amendment empowers the Minister to make regulations under the relevant enactments to extend such time limits for such a period as may be prescribed under that relevant enactment. The proposed new section 39D of the Interpretation and General Clauses Act provides that a person shall not commit an offense if he fails to observe a statutory deadline during the COVID-19 period, provided he discharges his obligation not later than such period as may be prescribed by regulations under the relevant enactment. The proposed new section 39E provides for an exemption from the mandatory requirement to follow continuous professional development courses for the current year. Moreover, necessary regulations will also be made under relevant enactments to exempt those professionals from payment of 50% of the CPD fees. Mr. Speaker, sir, it is apposite to highlight that the Interpretation and General Clauses Act, by virtue of Section 3.2, provides that, and I quote, unless the context otherwise requires or unless otherwise expressly provided, this Act shall apply to all enactments in force at its commencement, unquote. Therefore, the proposed amendments made to the Interpretation and General Clauses Act are of general application unless, under other enactments, express provisions are made to the contrary. Mr. Speaker, sir, Clause 29 is amending the Land Duties and Taxes Act to extend the statutory time limits as laid down in the Act. Let me now come to Clause 30, which is amending the Landlord and Tenant Act. As has been the case in many other countries, COVID-19 is likely to impact heavily on tenants and landlords. Eviction notices are likely to surge as a result of tenants being unable to fulfill their rental obligations due to loss of income due to the impact of COVID-19. For commercial tenants, evictions would result in the closing down of a number of businesses, including family-owned businesses, small retail shops, amongst others. This will in turn lead to job losses and negative impacts on surrounding businesses. For residential tenants, evictions would put households in further difficulty, leading to socio-economic problems associated with homelessness. In order to provide relief to tenants, including residential tenants, the Landlord and Tenant Act is being amended to introduce a moratorium for non-payment of rent by tenants due to COVID-19. Thus, non-payment of rent for the month of March, April, May, June, July, and August 2020, and such other subsequent months as may be prescribed, may be recouped by landlords in installments by 31st of December 2021, or such other date as may be prescribed. Such a measure will not constitute a breach of the tenancy agreement between the tenant and the landlord. The modalities for payment of the outstanding rents would need to be mutually agreed by both parties, and no eviction orders would be permitted for non-payment of rentals for these prescribed months. Mr. Speaker, sir, Clause 31 amends the Light Rail Act, inter alia, to 1. Increase the penalty for damage of light rail premises and light rail vehicles, which is presently a fine of up to 500,000 rupees and to imprisonment of up to 2 years, to a fine of up to 1 million rupees and imprisonment for up to 5 years. And 2, to empower the Minister to make regulations for sanitary measures during the COVID-19 period and such period as may be prescribed. Regulations so made may provide for A. Social distancing measures and other sanitary measures to be observed at light rail premises. B. The limitation of the number of passengers. C. Reduction and control of the operating hours. D. Thorough cleaning and regular disinfection. And E. The wearing of protective masks. Mr. Speaker, sir, Clauses 32 and 33 of the bill are respectively amending the Limited Liability Partnerships Act and the Limited Partnerships Act, so as to empower the registrar to issue during the COVID-19 period and such further period as the registrar may determine, such practice directions, guidelines, or instructions as may be necessary for the administration of the acts. It is to be noted that most stakeholders find themselves in difficult situation to comply with the strict delays and procedures as laid down in the law during the COVID-19 period. Clause 34 amends the definition of crop year in the Mauritius Cane Industry Authority Act to allow the sector to catch up for the time lost owing to the curfew for carrying out essential preliminary works prior to the harvest season. The Mauritius Revenue Authority Act is being amended by Clause 35 of the bill so as to extend any statutory delay which expires during the COVID-19 period relating to proceedings before the Assessment Review Committee. Clause 36 makes provision for the Mauritius Standards Bureau to declare during the COVID-19 period a document or an amendment as standard without public notice. Clause 37 amends the National Land Transport Authority Act to empower the licensing committee of the authority to make any variations in a license issued by the authority. Clause 38 is bringing amendment to the National Pensions Act so as not to penalize beneficiaries of invalids' basic pension and carers' allowance during the COVID-19 period or during such further period as may be prescribed pending their medical boarding. Clause 39 amends the National Youth Council Act to extend the mandate of the Council so that it may empower our youth to enable them face any epidemics or pandemics as well as other similar challenges. Clause 40 is amending the Passport Act to extend the validity of a visa which expires during the COVID-19 period or within 21 days thereafter. Clause 41 amends the Pharmacy Act to make provisions, inter alia, for the registration and sale of locally manufactured pharmaceutical products on the local market. The Plant Protection Act is being amended by Clause 42 to empower the National Plant Protection Office to impose terms and conditions upon a plant import permit being granted to an importer and to require importers to give 2 days' notice of the arrival of the importation for better supervision and inspection. Clause 43 amends the Police Act to increase the penalty for offences under the Act from a fine of 10,000 rupees and an imprisonment of 2 years to a fine of 100,000 rupees and 5 years imprisonment. Clause 44 is amending the Public Debt Management Act, taking into account the deep negative impact of the COVID-19 on the economy. It is proposed to amend the definition of public sector debt to allow for deduction therefrom of financial assets of non-financial public sector bodies. The aim is to focus on net instead of gross public sector debt in order to show their net financial worth situation. Mr. Speaker, sir, gross debt has the effect of inflating public sector debt and overstating the risks associated with the debt level, especially for countries that create assets that in turn allow the country to generate cash and cash equivalents. Gross debt to GDP ratios only account for the public sector liabilities, whereas net debt to GDP ratio also accounts for some of the assets and therefore reflects better the risks associated with debt. The IMF Government Finance Statistics Manual 2014 defines both gross and net debt. For statistics purposes, data are reported to the IMF on a gross basis to enable comparison across countries. However, the Government Finance Statistics Manual mentions that, and I quote, for some purposes, it may be useful to net individual debt instruments against their corresponding financial assets, end of quote. With the outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic, government has had to spend massively on the public health sector in order to enable our health services to cope with the crisis and save lives. In addition, government has implemented several schemes such as the Wage Assistance Scheme and Self-Employed Assistance Scheme to support employees as well as individuals in the informal sectors who have been affected by the pandemic. On the other hand, the general economic slowdown has negatively impacted on government revenues. Furthermore, as indicated by the IMF and other international organizations, there is extreme uncertainty around global economic growth prospects. These would depend on factors that are hard to predict, including the pathway of the pandemic and the extent of supply disruptions. Accordingly, it is considered appropriate to repeal the public sector debt ceiling at this stage. However, public sector debt targets would be set out as part of the budget exercise. Mr. Speaker, sir, Clause 45 of the bill is amending the Public Health Act to increase the fine, which is presently 500 rupees and 6 months imprisonment, to a fine of 200,000 rupees and 5 years of imprisonment. The Minister of Health is also being empowered to make regulations to prevent the resurgence and further spread of an infectious disease. This amendment is being made pending the introduction of a new and comprehensive Public Health Act. Clause 46 brings amendment to the Public Officers Protection Act to increase the fine for molesting, threatening, or intimidating public officers on duty. Clause 47 amends the Public Procurement Act to provide for the possibility of opening bids through technological means during the COVID-19 period. Clause 48 is amending the Registration Duty Act in order not to penalize taxpayers who cannot register their documents during the COVID-19 period. A surcharge is normally imposed on the administrative fee if a document is registered outside the prescribed delay. Stakeholders have requested for additional time to register their deeds or documents that could not be registered and to effect payment which could not be made owing to the curfew. All documents that could not be registered during the COVID-19 period and that will be presented for registration after the COVID-19 period has lapsed will not attract any surcharge on the administrative fee, provided the delay specified in the legislation is respected. Mr. Speaker, sir, the Road Traffic Act is being amended by Clause 49 of the bill to, inter alia, extend the different deadlines for the renewal of motor vehicle licenses and the payment of fines which expires during the COVID-19 period. The Minister is also being empowered to make provisions by way of regulations for sanitary measures to be observed during and after the COVID-19 period. Such regulations may provide, inter alia, for 1. Social distancing measures, 2. Sanitary measures to be observed in public service vehicles, and 3. Wearing of protective masks in public service vehicles. Mr. Speaker, sir, let me now come to the Sports Act. Clause 50 is bringing amendments to the Sports Act to make provisions for the operation and legal obligations of National Sports Federation during and after the COVID-19 period, and to ensure a smooth and successful resumption of sports activities in the best possible conditions. The key legal changes being brought to the Sports Act would, inter alia, 1. Allow the Ministry of Youth Empowerment, Sports and Recreation to address emergency situations regarding the sports sector in a controlled manner. 2. Require athletes and coaches, national sports federations, and other stakeholders to adhere strictly to directives issued by the Minister during the COVID-19 period. 3. Provide for the possibility to prohibit the organization of activities locally and participation at international sports events during the COVID-19 period unless expressly authorized by the Minister. 4. Require all national sports federations to take comprehensive sanitary measures as prescribed by the authorities before resuming training and competitions after the COVID-19 period. And 5. Require all national sports federations to ensure that all training and competitions are organized in camera for a prescribed period of time after the COVID-19 period. Clause 51 brings amendment to the Statutory Bodies, Accounts and Audit Act to provide for the modalities for statutory boards and committees to hold meetings by means of audio and audiovisual communication and for decisions to be taken by means of resolutions. The Sugar Insurance Fund Act is being amended by Clause 52 to, inter alia, enable planters and métayers to register with the board their cane plantations not later than such period as may be prescribed after the expiry of the COVID-19 period. The Tourism Authority Act is being amended by Clause 53 to empower the authority to issue, on ground of public health, guidelines to holders of pleasure crafts for the purposes of restricting the number of passengers on pleasure crafts and imposing such other conditions as may be necessary. Amendments are also being made for the extension of deadline for payment of penalty and extension of the validity of different licenses, certificates and permits which expire during the COVID-19 period. Provision is also being made for the payment of the renewal fees in monthly installments. The Transcription of Mortgage Act is being amended by Clause 54 such that no fee shall be payable for searches in the mortgage and transcription book for the month of April 2020 or such other period as may be prescribed. Clause 55 of the Utility Regulatory Authority Act is being amended to enable the authority to make available, upon request, electronic copies of the public register maintained by the authority and which contains information on every undertaking, authorization, and every regulatory decision by the authority. It is to be noted that the manual register is freely available to the public for inspection during normal office hours. Clause 56 amends the Value Added Tax Act to exempt, with effect from 24th March 2020, protective masks against dust and gas masks, breathing appliances and hand sanitizers from VAT, with a view to making these essential products more affordable in the context of COVID-19. Mr. Speaker, sir, I now come to Clause 57, which relates to the proposed amendments to the Workers' Rights Act. Mr. Speaker, sir, during this unprecedented and testing crisis of the COVID-19 pandemic, government is being called upon to fight on several fronts. If on one hand, the main concern of government is the upholding of the safety of the population, on the other hand, due to the adverse impact of the pandemic on the economy and enterprises, the protection of employment of our fellow workers has remained high on our agenda. It is with this primary objective of protecting jobs that a few amendments are being brought to the Workers' Rights Act. It is considered imperative in the present context to further promote workplace flexibility and adopt measures that contribute to reduce labor cost. I would here like to emphasize that it is not the intention of this government to deprive the workers of this country of their rights. Let us not forget that it is under my Prime Ministership that such revolutionary measures like the national minimum wage and more protective legislation like the Workers' Rights Act, which aim at inter alia improving the standard of living of workers and better reinforcing the rights of workers, were introduced. However, Mr. Speaker, sir, this exceptional situation calls for exceptional measures to be taken. This is why we are coming with the amendments in the Workers' Rights Act and the Employment Relations Act. I would like to reassure the population, the workers in particular, as well as the trade unions, that protection of employment and harmonious employment relations are for government of utmost importance for a sound working environment and the development of our economy. First of all, a new provision has been made to promote work from home in different manners, including teleworking. Such workers employed on a contract of service who were not covered under the present atypical work regulation will now be governed by this new provision. Mr. Speaker, sir, being able to work outside the office is one of the great workplace evolutions of modern times. Mr. Speaker, sir, just like other countries around the world, Mauritius also has been hit hard by the recent Covid-19 pandemic. In view of the compulsory work and travel restrictions, many organizations have had to figure out how to respond to this new paradigm. The challenge of maintaining operations and employee safety has led to an explosion of remote working initiatives, both in public and private sectors. Before the outbreak, many of these initiatives were still in their infancy and were often being considered for IT teams or some back office functions. The COVID-19 pandemic has pushed remote work to the top of every business and government's agenda. This measure will set the appropriate legal framework to facilitate work from home. It has the twin objective of reconciling work with family life and at the same time cutting down costs of operations for the employers while safeguarding the employment of employees. This is especially important considering our current challenges. Mr. Speaker, sir, the concept of flexi-time does not apply only to workers working from home, but also to workers normally performing work at their place of work. Previously, such arrangement was restrictive and was possible only for a worker to attend to a child below school age. A new provision is being made to facilitate the implementation of flexi-time in any circumstance, which may be either for the personal interests of the worker or the interests of the organization. Mr. Speaker, sir, the House will recall that we came up with a revolutionary concept of the Portable Retirement Gratuity Fund in the Workers' Rights Act, which was enacted on 23rd August 2019. The PRGF was to come into operation on 1st January 2020. However, the payment of upfront contribution to the fund was postponed to end of March 2020 to allow for the appropriate IT systems as well as administrative arrangements to be put in place. Payment of the contribution of employers, the Portable Gratuity Retirement Fund, which was due in April 2020, will be postponed and the date of its coming into operation will be prescribed. This amendment is being brought due to the serious cash flow problems being actually encountered by many enterprises. Mr. Speaker, sir, it is an undeniable fact that business activities of enterprises are being and will continue to be affected for a certain period of time because of the COVID-19. This is why it is considered necessary to make new provisions to diminish the impact of COVID-19 on the wage bill of enterprises. The payment of the allowance for work performed during the night will be suspended during that period. In the same vein, employers will be provided the option of either granting time off in lieu of overtime payment or pay overtime at the normal rate on weekdays and at the rate of twice the normal rate on public holidays, irrespective of whether work is performed for more than 8 hours or not on public holidays. However, in a spirit of fairness to workers, where workers have not been able to avail themselves of their time off, they will be refunded overtime payment on exit from employment or in December 2021, whichever comes first. I would like to state that amendments to the provisions regulating overtime would be applicable to 6 sectors only, namely the block making, construction, stone crushing and related industries, the catering and tourism industries, the travel agents and tour operators, the export enterprises, the manufacturing sector governed by the Factory Employees Remuneration Regulations and the ICT BPO. Mr. Speaker, sir, another temporary measure relates to the review of leave entitlement. The Workers' Rights Act actually provides that an employer shall not, without reasonable cause, withhold the granting of leave. Taking into consideration the financial constraints of the employers in the COVID-19 period and the likely impact on enterprises after the COVID-19 period, and also to be fair to workers and more especially to those who have been working during the confinement period, the following provisions are being made. Employers will have the right to withhold up to 15 days annual leave or such other number of annual leave as may be prescribed from the aggregate of the annual leave which accrues to a worker as from the beginning of the year of the COVID-19 period. This will apply over a period of 18 months following the expiry of the COVID-19 period. This means that over the said period of 18 months, a worker who would otherwise be entitled to 38 days leave calculated on a pro rata basis will now be entitled to at least 23 days annual leave. However, employers shall not have the right to withhold annual leave for workers who have performed work during the COVID-19 period. Mr. Speaker, sir, this will be a way for us to salute the efforts, courage, and dedication shown by this category of workers who have been working during this hazardous period. They have not only been bold enough to put at stake their lives, but at the same time, their families have also been exposed to the possibility of catching the COVID-19 virus. This August Assembly will no doubt agree with me that these workers are worthy of this recognition. In this connection, I shall move for an amendment to clause 57 of the bill at committee stage. Mr. Speaker, sir, in view of the vulnerability of the economy and also with the objective of preservation of employment, 2 main amendments are being brought to the Workers' Rights Act. Firstly, a new employer will be able to offer employment on new terms and conditions in cases of transfer of undertaking or taking over of a trade or business in sectors, amongst others, the port, the airport, and health, subject to the approval of the minister responsible for the subject of labor. Secondly, speedy procedures have also been put in place in cases of reduction of workforce in these sectors, subject to the approval of the minister responsible for the subject of labor. Cases will be referred directly to the redundancy board by the employer and the board would have to complete its proceedings within 15 days from the date of notification. Furthermore, with a view to protecting employment, the board shall, where a termination is deemed to be justified, order that a worker or such category of workers as the employer may designate proceed on leave without pay for such period as the employer may specify in his notification. This will be in lieu of termination. It will also be conditional to a request of the employer and consent of the worker. The resumption of employment thereafter will be on such new terms and conditions as the employer may offer to the worker. The offer should be made prior to resumption of work, and the new terms and conditions may also include revised pension benefits. Mr. Speaker, sir, with a view to reducing further the hardship on workers, I shall propose at committee stage an amendment to Section 84(1) of the Workers' Rights Act, which has as objective to allow a worker who is granted leave without pay, following an order of the Redundancy Board, and who has not taken up another employment during the period of leave, to be entitled to payment of the transition unemployment benefit. The relevant amendment is being circulated. Mr. Speaker, sir, Clause 58 provides for the date of the coming into effect of the different sections of the Covid-19 Act. Mr. Speaker, sir, this new legislation will come into force with retrospective effect, as indeed provided for in Section 46(4) of the Constitution. However, insofar as criminal offences and penalties are concerned, the law will not apply with retrospective effect pursuant to the provisions of Section 10(4) of the Constitution. Mr. Speaker, sir, I am also moving at committee stage an amendment to Clause 58 of the bill, which sets out which sections of the bill will come into effect on which specific dates. Mr. Speaker, sir, I now come to the quarantine bill. As the House is aware, quarantine is an important aspect of control of the outbreak of infectious diseases. Besides, following the outbreak of the COVID-19, the World Health Organization recommended the implementation of quarantine as part of a comprehensive package, public health response and containment measures. The government accordingly implemented quarantine measures very rapidly, and this has contributed significantly to contain the spread of the virus in our country. However, our existing Quarantine Act dates as far back as 1954. There is therefore a need for a modern and more effective quarantine legislation which will enhance the level of preparedness and response of our health authorities to communicable diseases and pandemics such as the COVID-19. It is noteworthy that quarantine and isolation are likely to remain the mainstay of containment strategies in the absence of a vaccine and antiviral agents. Mr. Speaker, sir, as indicated in the explanatory memorandum, the object of the new quarantine bill is precisely to repeal the existing Quarantine Act and provide for a modern and a more appropriate legislative framework for the prevention and spread of communicable diseases in Mauritius. I would like to point out that the quarantine bill we are presenting today is respectful of the fundamental rights and freedoms guaranteed by the Constitution and is also in line with international health regulations of 2005. I shall now go through the salient features of the quarantine bill. Clause 2 of the bill defines the term communicable disease, and a list of such diseases is provided in the schedule. It is to be noted that in the existing Act, and regulations, the definition of quarantinable disease was limited to plague, cholera, and yellow fever. Clause 2 further provides that the quarantine authority shall be the Director General Health Services. The quarantine authority will have the power to, inter alia, designate premises to be used as quarantine facilities and to designate quarantine officers to control such facilities. There is no explicit provision in the existing legislation for the designation of quarantine facilities. The bill provides in a clear manner the designation, staffing, use, and management of the quarantine facility. Clause 3 empowers the Prime Minister to make, during a quarantine period, an order to A. Prohibit the entry of aircraft and ships into Mauritius. B. Order that all persons shall remain indoors. And C. Order that commercial premises or offices shall remain closed for such period and under such terms and conditions as he may specify. Clause 3 also provides for the Commissioner of Police to issue a permit to allow a person to be outdoors for such purpose and under such terms and conditions as he may specify. No such provision exists under the Quarantine Act of 1954. Mr. Speaker, sir, the bill is introducing a new concept of quarantine period. As a matter of fact, where the Minister of Health considers that a communicable disease may outbreak or spread in Mauritius, Clause 4 is empowering him to declare that A. There is or is likely to be an epidemic of the disease, and B. A quarantine period will be in force. It is to be noted that the Prime Minister can issue an order under Clause 3 only after a quarantine period has come into force. Clause 5 provides that the quarantine authority, that is, the Director General Health Services, may designate such premises as he considers appropriate to be a quarantine facility. Clause 5 further provides that the quarantine authority may use and occupy private premises as quarantine facility after reaching an agreement with the owner and occupier on such terms and conditions as the Minister may approve. Such agreement shall, for obvious reason, be exempted from the provisions of the Public Procurement Act. Moreover, any such quarantine facility must be under the control of the quarantine officer. Clause 6 provides for the quarantine authority to designate a medical practitioner as quarantine officer. Clause 7 defines the category of persons who may be confined in a quarantine facility, namely A. Any person who travels into Mauritius from abroad. B. Any person who has been or may have been in contact with a person who has or may have a communicable disease. Or C. Any person who has otherwise been exposed to a communicable disease. It is noteworthy that a person may be quarantined only during a quarantine period. Mr. Speaker, sir, Clause 7 also provides for a quarantine person to be issued with a certificate of quarantine and for the person to undergo such medical examination as the quarantine officer may deem necessary. Provisions have also been made for a quarantine person in need of medical treatment to be examined by a specialist and for him to be transferred to a hospital for treatment or in a private health institution upon his request and at his own cost. However, such private health institutions should have been designated as a quarantine facility under this Act and have adequate facilities for treating the disease. Furthermore, Clause 7 provides for the conditions for discharge of a quarantined person and the conditions for the readmission of a discharged person into a quarantine facility. In fact, if a person who has been discharged from a quarantine facility fails to comply with the conditions imposed or causes a risk of harm to the public health, the quarantine authority may at any time order that the person be readmitted into a quarantine facility. Clause 8 provides that no person shall enter or leave a quarantine facility without the authorization of a quarantine officer. Clause 9 imposes a duty on every person to provide to a quarantine officer such information as the latter may reasonably require to enable him to ascertain, inter alia, if the person presents any symptoms of any communicable disease. Failure to comply with such a request or providing false or misleading information constitutes an offense. Clause 10 imposes a duty on any person who suspects that he is or may be afflicted with a communicable disease or has been in contact with a person who has a communicable disease to disclose the information forthwith to a quarantine officer, and failure to comply with this provision will constitute an offense. Clause 11 defines the powers of the police in relation to the enforcement of a Quarantine Act. It provides that a police officer shall extend such assistance as may be required by a quarantine officer in the discharge of his duties. The police officer may also A. board a ship or an aircraft, B. enter premises without a warrant, and C. arrest without a warrant a person whom he has reasonable cause to believe has committed an offense under the Act or any regulations made under the Act. Clause 12 makes provision for the offenses and penalties. This clause provides that any person who A. refuses to answer or knowingly gives a misleading answer to an inquiry made under the authority of this Act, B. intentionally withholds any information reasonably required of him by a person acting under the authority of this Act, C. knowingly furnishes to a person any information which he knows to be false, D. refuses or willfully omits to do an act which is required to do by this Act, E. refuses or willfully omits to carry out a lawful order, instruction or condition made, given or imposed by a person acting under the authority of this Act, F. assaults, resists, insults, willfully obstructs, or intimidates a person acting under the authority of this Act, G. whilst being in a quarantine facility damages any property therein, or H. otherwise contravenes the Act or any regulations, order, or notice under the Act, shall commit an offense and shall on conviction be liable to a fine not exceeding 500,000 rupees and to imprisonment for a term not exceeding 5 years. Clause 13 empowers the Minister of Health and Wellness to make regulations as he thinks fit for the purposes of the Act. Such regulations may provide, inter alia, for A. the location, design, construction, installation, operation, maintenance, marking, and modification of a quarantine facility. B. operation and management of quarantine facilities. C. information to be provided by passengers entering Mauritius. And D. levying of fees and charges. Clause 14 is repealing the Quarantine Act. Mr. Speaker, sir, I will now conclude Mr. Speaker, sir, I did state at the outset that the presentation of these two bills is an eloquent testimony of the unflinching determination with which this government has been waging the war against the COVID-19. During a period of war, nothing can be as usual. Nor can it be as usual in the aftermath of the war, when reconstruction, retaking off of the economy, uplifting the nation, firmly establishing and consolidating national solidarity, reliance on a spirit of sacrifice and patience across the board, meaningful and purposeful patriotism, hard and still harder work for which there can be no substitute, national understanding and collaboration, protection of the economically weak and vulnerable citizens are imperatively among the highest priorities. As a democratic and truly responsible and caring government, we are coming with these two bills in the best and superior interest of our people, of our country, and of our nation. Bitter pills and bitter medicine, which are best for good health, are not easily taken. However, ailing persons do take them when they realize that these are good for them. Both bills illustrate the pragmatism, in a way pills also, the pragmatism and foresight of the government, and together they aim at ensuring that while disappearing from our republic, COVID-19 neither returns and causes more damages, nor lingers on while disappearing and thus delaying our gradual but sure return to normalcy. Mr. Speaker, sir, our country has been bent down by the COVID-19, but has not broken due to the expedient measures we have been taking. We have to date been weathering the COVID-19 storm successfully. In fact, there have been no new cases of COVID-19 reported over the last 16 consecutive days. Moreover, as at date, we have no active case of COVID-19 in Mauritius. I must say that we have succeeded in keeping COVID-19 at bay thanks to the collaboration of the entire population from every walk of life and from every nook and corner. This collaboration is a sine qua non for final victory over the invisible enemy. Mr. Speaker, sir, life, it is said, is like a boxing ring. You are in the ring and you fall. But it does not matter if you fall. What does really matter is you get up before the count of 10 and fight on and win. We in this government are up and continue the fight against COVID-19, and we will win. With these words, Mr. Speaker, sir, I commend the two bills to the House.
I get up and suspend the meeting for 1 hour.